Hi, I'm Josh Nathanson, and I wanted to access Schwab's Developer API as an individual developer, and I had trouble finding documentation for how to perform the authentication and the API calls. So this video kind of puts together some of the things that I've learned, and I'll show you some of the code that I've used to perform the authentication. But first, I wanted to go through some assumptions, requirements, and the big picture for the workflow. So my assumptions are that you have a Schwab individual developer account that's been activated, as well as an API request that's been fully approved, not just approved pending. So it takes a couple of days for each of those steps to take place. So once you've been fully approved, then this video is for you. I also developed everything in Python 3, so that's a requirement. And I also highly recommend the use of Python virtual environments, which I'll go over. And then yeah, some familiarity with HTTP post and GET requests is helpful because we'll be using a requests module in Python to perform the HTTP requests. So specifically requirements, I'm using Python 3.1, 3.0. And I've installed the following Python modules in my virtual environment, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. So I've installed requests, OAuth which is the authentication framework that Schwab uses, Paperclip, which is simply a tool to copy something to the clipboard, and the thing that I copy to the clipboard is a URL, and I'll go over that. .env, which is used to store secrets as environment variables instead of hard coding them into my code. That's very important from a security perspective. And then Python cron tab, because one of the tokens that we'll get back through the authentication process expires every 30 minutes. And the cron tab sets a reminder to refresh the token every 30 minutes. So why OAuth 2? OAuth 2 has some very nice, it's actually well known and used fairly commonly across many different organizations. And it's one of the key features is that you never have to code or transmit your username and password through your code. The authentication takes place through a normal web interface. So you'd put in your username and password in a normal HTTPS web session, which is just normal authentication. And through that process, we will use our API key and our API secret, and the tokens in return, that all of those combined replace our username and login authentication, so that Schwab knows that we are making the request, even though we're not using username and password for each request. And finally, the tokens expire every 30 minutes, and I'll go over that also. Overall, big picture, the workflow is going to be, we'll use our API key and our API secret to get an initial bearer token. The bearer token is what we'll use to call the API functions. So if we want to get market data or specific account data, we use the bearer token. And these bearer tokens are the tokens that expire every 30 minutes. So we'll need to refresh the token. It's not a big deal if the token expires. It's just that you'll have to go back and re-authenticate with your username and password on the website if the token expires. And then finally, a quick note on the setup and the security. There's a lot of secrets that are required for this authentication to take place, and they should never be hard-coded in any Python script or other code file. The way I've implemented the secrets is I've stored them as environment variables in a .env file, and there's a call in my Python script that will get those values from the .env file, and then when I get the token back from Schwab, I save that in a token.json file. It's very important that these files are not shared with anybody, so if you're synchronizing your code with GitHub or sharing it with anybody else, make sure that nobody else can see those secrets in the .env file and the token.json file, because anybody can access your Schwab account with those tokens and information. So it's very important to add those to a git ignore if you are synchronizing with GitHub. Hi, so now we're going to go through the actual code, and in order to do that I have to load my Python virtual environment. So I've created a virtual environment by running the command and then name env. So actually I called it TOS env, thinkorswim environment. And this will create a subdirectory in your current directory that Python Virtual Environment Manager uses to manage the virtual environment. In order to activate that environment, you simply do source, the directory name, and then there's a bin directory that's created, and then there's a file called activate. Once that file is sourced, the prompt is indicating which virtual environment is active, and I know that I can now run my Python script with all the requirements that are needed. The Python requirements are included in the pip freeze command. So this is showing me all the modules that I've installed to make this script work. I didn't install every single one of these. Some of them are dependent modules of the modules that I did install, but you can take this list and you can actually feed it into pip, and it will install all the requirements. And this should be a part of your distribution if you're going to share it and make it available to others. So now that we have the virtual environment activated, we can start running the script. So this script is on the screen, is my authentication script, and I'm just going to run it and walk you through it. Okay, so I've created a main function and a very rudimentary menu, and this is the script I'm going to run to get a new token, to refresh my token every 30 minutes, and I've also created a timer or reminder to remind me to refresh my token every 30 minutes so it doesn't expire. So I'm going to create a new token. The new token copies a URL to the clipboard, and then it's asking me for a URL in return. So what happens now? So let's just walk through the code a little bit. So the code requires requests, which is the HTTP request module in Python, an operating system module to grab the environment variables, base64 to convert some text into URL-friendly text, paperclip, which is a module that copies text into the clipboard, JSON to help facilitate, manipulate JSON formatted files or responses, .env, which is how we manage some of the secrets, and then cron tab, which is how I implemented the reminder every 30 minutes. So first thing is I've added my Schwab API key and Schwab API secret environment variables to a file called .env. Now these environment variables are not part of my day-to-day environment. They're only available when I load them through load.env. So whatever's in here will get loaded only for this Python script. Once I do load env, those Python variables are available through regular OS get env call. So now that I have my key value, my secret value, there's a couple of hard-coded URLs that are just hard-coded. There's no rhyme or reason to them. This is the token URL we'll use to refresh the token, and this is the authentication URL we'll use to authenticate. And so this is the URL that was actually copied to my clipboard right now. This is in my clipboard, except obviously API key is populated with the actual API key value, and the redirect URI must be the same that as the URI that was registered with the app on Schwab Developer. So this whole URL is in my clipboard. So I'm going to open up Chrome, and I think Schwab does not support Safari. So you have to use Chrome or Firefox or whatever they use on Windows. Um, and I'm going to copy that URL into my browser. And then that URL is going to take me to a schwab.com um, authentication screen where I put in my username and password. Now, this is the only place you put in a username and password, but this is the exact same uh, authentication and security that you would use to log into your account anyway. So this is nothing. This is nothing special in terms of authentication. So I'm going to put in my regular, not my developer, but my regular Schwab username and password. And then this is going to ask me for my, it's going to ask me to click that you've read some disclaimer, and then you have to accept, and then it's going to ask you which account do you want to connect to this API if you have multiple accounts. And then it's going to tell you that it was connected, and then it's going to say this site can't be connected or unable to connect or error 404. But as long as that web page has a URL that includes the word code in it, you were probably successful in performing the authentication because all we need is the code from that URL. So the URL is going to look something like this. Okay, so we've authenticated on schwab.com and it returned a URL that looks like this. This isn't the actual URL because I don't want to share the code that was returned, even though I think it's a temporary code. But the URL in return looks something like this, and this code will be a very long random string. And this is basically the only part of the URL that we want to copy. So in my code, once I get the input URL, the response code is manipulated to grab only the part of the URL that is the code. Once we have the code, that's called our response code. Then we have to generate a payload for the authentication HTTP request. And this, again, is just kind of very technical stuff that is required. I'm not exactly sure what the reasons are, but we're requesting a grant type authorization code. And here's the code that we just got from the response URL. And again, the redirect URI is the same redirect URI that we submitted with the app request on Schwab Developer Portal. So now is the request. Look, I'm not the world's best developer, but this request is used a couple of times, so I just made a separate function for it. And we're sending it the token URL and the payload. So make request basically takes the URL and the payload, and initially it defaults to a post request, which is what's required for the authentication. And here's the actual request command. So we're posting to the URL the headers, which are here, and they're just fixed headers, and then the data, which is the payload that we've provided, that we just generated down below. So it's important to recognize that for post requests, data is submitted in the data parameter, but for GET requests, we do it through a params parameter instead of a data parameter. So that's an important distinction between post and GET. But this is a post request. So let's go back to the request. And I'm not going to do it now because I'm not using the right URL. I'm just going to Control C out of it. but we get from that post request, from this request, we're just sending an HTTP post request, and we get a response that is in the form of our token. So we'll get it, and we'll save that to a token.json file, and now we have our bearer token. So that's the bearer token, and I'll show you what we do with the bearer token later. In the meantime, now I've also implemented a reminder, which is basically this. So if you want the reminder to run, it will use a cron tab to remind you to reset the bearer token on the 29th minute and the 59th minute going forward until you delete the cron tab entry. So what that means is your first token might expire a little bit early. So let's say you got your first token at 15 after the hour. Well, the first reminder is going to come at 29 after the hour. So that'll be a short token, but it doesn't matter. You can refresh the token early without any problems. So, so how do we do that? So the cron tab looks like this. And I have a cron tab that will actually say token. And this is, I'm working on a MacBook Pro, so I don't know how this works on other computers, but you can do whatever, you can put whatever command you want to do in 30 minutes to beep or to set an alarm or to set a reminder or pop up or whatever you want to do. So I kind of like that it says token. I don't know, I think that's pretty cool. And then to refresh the token, all we're going to do is run command number 2 from my script, and command number 2 runs refresh token. Doesn't require any input or anything. You just have to run it, and it will take the token that's found in the token.json file, and it will set up a new payload now because we're refreshing a token as opposed to using an authorization code, and it gets the token from the JSON file. So we're refreshing this token, and then once you run this, we run another request with the token URL, which is the same URL we got our initial token with, but it's a different payload now when we're doing the refresh. And when we do the refresh, all it does is it gets a response, and the response is the same format as the original token request. So I just override that token.json file, and the way I know that it's current is I can list that JSON file, and I know that it was created at 12:05, which is about 13 minutes ago. So that's basically the whole authentication process. So now that we have the bearer token, we're going to switch over to actually making API calls. Okay, so now that we have our authenticated bearer token, we can use that to perform API calls. And I'm using the Schwab Market Data API just as an example. And there's a lot of very complicated calls that can take place. And I'm going to show you just one API call to get a quote, a simple quote, and I'm going to show you how complicated just a simple quote can be. So I wrote this script that is kind of a testing script for me. So there's a couple of different API calls that I'm playing around with, but we're just going to focus on the get quote API call. And so let's run the script. And I'm just going to give it a symbol, let's say Apple. And so what's going to happen? So it's going to take that symbol and it's going to, oh, I don't know if you can hear that, but my computer just reminded me to refresh the token. So I'm going to Control-C out of this, and I'm going to run my authentication script. And I'm just going to refresh my token. And that's it. Response 200 means that it probably worked, and my token is now set for another 30 minutes. So I'm going to run my market data script again. And I'm going to type in Apple. And Apple is, I'm going to run my get quote for Apple. So what does get quote do? Um, so get quote takes a symbol and it creates a payload. And the payload is basically the definition of what fields do you want back um, from the quotes API call. So this is actually fairly well documented on Schwab.com, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. So then I just craft my request. So this is a GET request as opposed to a POST request that was required for authentication. And the server is the same server for all of these requests, and that's just a fixed server. The symbol is the symbol that I just submitted. And then quotes, which is the quotes API call. So headers is from get headers. And again, this is just requires, this is where the authentication token is being gotten from the JSON from the token.json file. I'm using the JSON Python module to load the authentication token, the bearer token, which is called access token in the JSON file. And then there's a couple of additional headers that are required, which is just a requirement from the API. And then the key header is the authorization header, which has the bearer token and the bearer token value from the token.json file. So once I have the headers, I send it the payload. And again, when we're doing a GET request, I provide the payload through a params parameter as opposed to a data parameter that we used in the POST request. So that's important. And then the payload is just for quote, which is, I think, the simplest return value. There's so many other functionality that the quotes call can provide. But I'm just going to do a simple quote just to keep it simple. So we're going to run this down here. And then it gets the response, and then it actually prints the response, and it dumps it to a quote.json. So I'm going to open my quote.json file. And these are all the values that were provided by that quote call. And I guess it's just important to recognize that even for a simple quote is not so simple, right? So a simple quote could be anything. So if you want to ask price or a bid price or a closing price or last price, right? Any one of those could be called a quote. So when you get quote, you first have to identify which one of these values you're looking for, and then extract that, and then go and do whatever manipulation you want with those values. So I just wanted to use this as a simple example. It's the quote JSON looks a little prettier when it gets printed. So just be aware that this is a very simple call, and there was so much so many values that were returned. There's other calls that can be made, like I was playing around with historical data, which requires a lot of information to provide to the API call to tell it, do you want daily data, weekly data, monthly data, how far back do you want the data, what are the start date and the end date of the data. So, and again, this is fairly well documented on Schwab.com. And it can get very complicated to run some of these APIs. And then I was playing around with the option chains API call as well. So that's as far as I got. I hope this is helpful. Please please like the videos if you thought it was helpful, and please feel free to leave a comment, and I'll try and get back to you. Thanks a lot.